yet, or do you want to wait for a couple of minutes? It started.
Okay. Rafa,
yes, we are. We are ready to start. Thank you. Chairman, we are ready to start.
Morena councillors, kia ora koutou everybody. Welcome to the Bay of Plenty Toimoana Regional Council meeting of 31st of March. In opening the meeting, I'll remind councillors and staff this meeting is being live streamed and recorded, and that the recording will be made available on the Bay of Plenty Regional Council website following this meeting. In doing so, I'd remind you all that the local government decision-making affords no protection to councillors, councillor staff and public for comments made during meetings that are subsequently challenged in a court of law and determined to be slanderous. I'll start the proceedings with a karakia. Councillor White, could I invite you to open the hui with karakia, please?
Kia ora no tātou te tiamana me koutou hoki ko tā mana I tēnei rā, kei noi tātou. He honore, he krore ki te atua, he maunga rongo ki ta mato ta whenua whakaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa me. Hāngai te atu he ngā kauhau ki roto ki tēnā o mātou. Whakatongi o tau wairua tapu hei a whina, hei toho tohi o mātou mahi I mui a koutou I tēnei rā. Ko hukurati o koutou mātou kai whakao. Amen.
Kia ora, Councillor White. Next agenda item is apologies. Tono, we have apologies from Councillor Thompson.
We do. I've not been advised of any further apologies.
Thank you. I'll move the apologies be sustained. Seconded. Mr. Von Dellison. All those in favour, raise your hand. Thank you. Carried.
Public forum. There was an apology for Councillor Etie. Was that right? Not mentioned.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Yes, Councillor Etie gave us an apology for the whole week.
Yeah.
So could we add him to that, Tono?
Absolutely added. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no public forum. There's no items not on the agenda to be added. Order of business. There's no change to the order of business. Declaration of conflicts of interest. I don't believe there are any. Councillors, are you aware of any? No. We'll carry on to reports. We'll go to 7.1, statement of proposal for changes to policies, page 9 of your agenda. Some of these are procedural and others require some explanation. Can I hand over to Mark LeComte, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning we're asking for permission to consult on 4 statements of proposals that have been developed alongside our annual plan process. I'll quickly go through the key points on each of those and then hand over for discussion and questions. The first one is a proposed amendment to the revenue and financing policy. There are a few amendments in there. One to better explain how we approach affordability. Another one to textual change to incorporate the principles of the Te Ture Whenua Māori Act, and then 2 substantive proposed changes to allow for targeted rates to be set for regional infrastructure and for sustainable homes. The regional infrastructure one has been discussed by a number of councils over the past few years. We've received requests from a variety of projects to be able to provide a capital grant and recover that money through collecting rates in that area. Examples of that over the past few years include the Aotearoa Fanhead and the Rotary Museum. In both of those cases, we decided to actually grant the money from our reserves with no recollection of the capital sums involved. So those are one of the things that contributes to our reserve balance forecasts. The proposal at the moment is simply to consult on the ability to set a targeted rate for both of those. It's not intended to set a targeted rate in the immediate future for a couple of reasons. First of all, project for the regional infrastructure's targeted rate would need to be agreed and would actually need to do some more detailed consultation on the actual amount of the targeted rate. So it's purely an enabling provision which would allow you to consider setting a targeted rate in the future. The process it would go through, we'd have public consultation, deliberations, and then whatever process is needed to agree which projects may be required. Now, there are obviously pros and cons to this ability. It is, of course, of interest to a lot of our district and city councils to alleviate some of their capital constraints, but it also brings a potential source of rating conflict or concern from the community. So you need to balance the role you want to have in regional leadership of those sorts of projects against the ability and to consider financial prudence. So it's really while it's an early day, it is a very important political decision. On the sustainable homes targeted rate, that is to enable a so-called voluntary targeted rate to be set to recover any loans that are made for sustainable homes upgrades. Mr. Chairman, I see we've already got one hand up. Would you like me to proceed to the other statements of proposal, or would you like to cover the revenue on financing one first?
We'll do the current one. Councillor Von Duddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I'm a little bit concerned about the regional infrastructure investment. I don't think we've had a genuine discussion amongst the councillors to even come up with a view on this. And this is a very important one. I personally don't favour it as a targeted rate, but that aside, I think we shouldn't have been going out for consultation without having had a really wide-ranging discussion. My view is that I'm all for a regional infrastructure fund availability, and I think it has worked very well in the past. When we put the first $40 million fund together, it was taken up, and it's taken a while because of the Aotearoa Harbour to get that complete, but it has allowed investment across the whole of the region, but it's not evenly distributed, and over time that's not an issue short term, but over time it does want to be. But to have a targeted rate for it, I think that's looking for more fundraising. I think that's where we the funds that come out of from the quayside investments, for instance, is an avenue that we should be using more for that fund, to establish a fund, and rather than actually using that money for day-to-day operational. And I know it lowers the rates for ratepayers, but I think it gives a perception, at least, of a lazy balance sheet, and doesn't encourage efficiency and effectiveness. So I've got real concerns that this has come to us to go straight out for consultation without us having had a pretty robust discussion before we even start. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor Von Duddleston. Can I just remind you and everybody, as has been stated, this recommendation, if it is to proceed, is an enabling recommendation only. What you are requesting, Councillor Von Duddleston, is totally appropriate, and that is that a process and a criteria that, if this was to be actioned, has yet to be determined, discussed by the regional council. So it's not as if we're going to do this. A process and criteria as to how, or even if you want to do it, will follow in due course.
I think if you, through you, Mr. Chair, just on that, by putting it out for consultation, yes, it is an enabling process, but what you're unintendedly probably indicating is that this is a suggestion of councillors that is well worthy of going forward. And I don't think we're in a position to have done that. I think this is premature, and putting it out for consultation, even though it be enabling, is sending the wrong signal. We should be actually, as governors, having a pretty clear view where we want to go before we go out for consultation on any issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Von Duddleston. I'll remind you and everybody that the only reason this is on the agenda is it's been workshopped twice before and councillors wanted to put on the agenda. So, Councillor Ness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You've just made the point that I was going to make. We have discussed this a number of times. We have seen this policy in draft before, and I support it because it is an enabling policy, and it's a tool that we will be able to use should we desire, or if perhaps a territorial local authority asks us to help them with a particular project. So unless we have this in our toolbox, we won't be able to do that. And I think it's entirely appropriate that we put this out to see what the community thinks, whether or not this is a good idea or not.
Thank you, Councillor Nees. Councillor Crosby.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Mark. On page 18, and I think twice through the agenda, two other times, we have the forms about what do you think, which are good. The part of that I have an issue with is really around the private information that you're asking people to provide. Now, I do appreciate you can say prefer not to say, but what I'd like to see at the top of that section is optional, because these types of forms and with that kind of request can put people off, and they might feel as if they don't fill them out, particularly that section around their private information, that you know, their submission won't be taken into account. Trust me, that's how people do think sometimes. So I prefer to just put the word optional up there, so people don't feel obliged to fill out that information. I understand why you're seeking to collect it, so you can get an understanding of the demographic of people that are submitting, but there can be a barrier to submitting.
Thank you, Councillor Crosby. Mr. Lecomte, continue.
So thank you for that feedback, councillors. On the other statements of proposal, the next one is the proposal on our fees and charges policy. At the moment, our fees and charges are under pressure. They are set to, under our revenue and financing policy, they're targeted to deliver about 40% of the revenue required for our regulatory activities. Due to cost increases, petrol, staffing, consultancy, we often have an annual increase in fees and charges. At the moment, acknowledging we're in a very high inflationary environment and the inflation rates are uncertain, our best estimate currently is that up to an 8% increase on fees and charges is required to achieve our targeted fee and charge revenue for those activities. If we don't set our fees and charges high enough, those extra costs, which reflect private benefit, end up being borne by the general ratepayer. So while it's a potentially larger than desired increase, we need to make sure we've got the balance right between who pays in terms of the beneficiaries and the exacerbators, the private and public good. While we're consulting on this proposal, we still have an amount of work to do, and we still need to see the latest cost indices, and we are hopeful that we can bring the final fee and charge amount down, but we just need to see the data. On the next statement of proposal is on the rates, remissions and postponements policy. That's been workshopped through a number of times, both with council and been through Committee Māori to do some early engagement. This is a direct consequence of us collecting our own rates, where in the past, each district or city council would act as our agent in assessing rates, remissions and postponements. We need to have our own policy, and that does address a number of issues of standardisation across the region. One of the most important things to note in this is there is a transition provision that anyone that has a remission currently and has that remission continued in the next financial year, we automatically honour that remission. So no one is worse off in at least the next financial year. And this extra time enables us to collect some more data and more granular data on the people that may be affected and how it affects them. So the intention is to roll this policy out this first time, collect the data through any transition arrangements, and do another consultation once we have better data and a better understanding of the public views, noting that no one will be worse off in the next financial year. The last statement of proposal is around the proposal to become a shareholder of a regional shared services organisation. As a council-controlled organisation, we must consult on becoming a shareholder. Currently, we receive services from the CCO at the moment, and we pay for those services. We're not intending to change in the short term the amount of services we receive or the amount we pay, but becoming a shareholder gives us a better say in the services that are delivered for the future. So much like we work with other shared services organisations, this is one that is specifically targeted at the regional council sector. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy for any other questions or comments.
All right, councillors, any questions or comments? I see Councillor Von Duddleston, you got your hand up. It's been up for a while now. It's probably from the last time.
No, that's a new one. Fees and charges. I have no problem with going out and consulting on this. However, again, I have concerns about some of the costs that our staff are charging for two individuals for consents, for instance. And I'll give you just one example where a geothermal bore, the senior staff member who was in charge of it, spent 55 hours on a report for one consent. 55 hours. Now, I did chaired the hearing for the Rangataiki River for PC13, I think it was. No, can't remember. But the Rangataiki anyway, that one, I spent 103 hours, including hearings time, and writing my own decision, 103, I think, page decision, and at half the hours. So at only twice the hours of what this senior, that wasn't all the hours, that was just one senior person's hours, 55 hours. So, and the person applying for the consent had no comeback on that. So it just highlights to me that yes, we have to make sure that it's fair and equitable, and I have no problem with that. But we also need to put a blowtorch to make sure that our ratepayers aren't being overly charged, which I believe they are. And I've had several constituents come to me in the last couple of years, quite a few actually, complaining about the level of fees. And the geothermal one is an interesting one. One of my constituents spent $40,000 on trying to get a consent for a geothermal, and in the end threw it out and went because he could see that he just wasn't getting anywhere, and went to a heat converter instead. And that's just an example. So I don't want to be specific in here on these, but it just highlights the need that we actually keep a blowtorch on costs and efficiency, and don't just accept 8% rises for the sake of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Von Duddleston. So I think the message there, which I also agree with, is that a singular focus on the CPI as justification needs to be questioned. Now, having said that, Mr. Lecomte did qualify that and said there needs to get the data to see whether or not the data does support some increase. So I think that's a principle that we need to adopt. Councillor Nees, then Councillor Winters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've just got two questions about the actual consultation document for sustainable homes. When we had our workshop, I sent staff some questions and comments. One of my questions was around the term for the sustainable home loan, and that still was not mentioned in the statement of summary of proposed charges on page 17. So it does say, though, that it's a differential, and it would be based on the value of the loan, etc. So is that code for we will change the term depending on how much the loan is for?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Nees, and through the chair. No, that is not necessarily code for changing the term of the loan. That is purely amount that the targeted rate set would need to be an appropriate amount to recover the loan over the agreed term. So some of the loans may be for $1,000, some may be for $10,000, etc. So it's purely to reflect the change in capital value. In the first year of operation, my understanding is that most of the payment the use of the sustainable homes will be via grant, so focused on low income, and there's still some work to go through in terms of Credit Act compliance around the actual use of the loan. So again, this is an enabling provision. Much like we had the clean heat loans in Rotorua that have been successful and run for a number of years, it's applying the same approach. So no, we will not be changing the terms of the loan necessarily. Any loan that is signed up to will be agreed in writing with the relevant ratepayer.
And so they are going to be of variable lengths, or do we have a standard length for one of these loans?
At the moment, it is in theory possible to have a variable length. In the Rotorua Clean Heat, we've kept them all at a standardized length. There is currently no limit, but practically the intention of the scheme is that the savings through less energy consumption would be able to pay back the loan at no bottom line cost to the ratepayer. So it would be, in my view, generally favourable to keep the loans in that less than 5-year term.
So I think this is an important bit of information that the ratepayers need to understand to give us the feedback. So I still do request that we consider some addition of words to address the term, because the actual summary of proposed changes is silent on that, and it might have an impact on what people think. My second issue is around the on page 100, there's a statement about the remission of Maryland under development. And a question that I asked previously was, have we any guidance on how long a land can be, Maryland can be given a remission being under development? Because some, this might extend on for quite some considerable time. So are we thinking about some sort of criteria around the length of time that Maryland can be under development? Is it for imminent development, or is it we think we'll develop it sometime in the future, but we haven't got any imminent time frame? I just need some clarification about that, please.
Yeah, so thank you again, Councillor. That's one of the items we've got some legal advice on around setting terms. The intention is that we would agree a remission upfront before the redevelopment, any development commences. So it is for a projected project plan. It's not intended to be an indefinite, we think we might develop this in 5 years' time and start some work. It's really for the period of the actual works being done. Now, it is where it becomes difficult to set a term is that with a clever staging of the project, you can have various parts become operational. So the intention is that you'd work with people on their development to try and get stages of the development operational, and then only remit on those areas that are still under development, rather than the whole site being remitted for a long period of time.
So once again, I just wonder whether we shouldn't be a little bit more explicit about our thinking on that, because the document is silent, and we may not get the feedback that we otherwise would if people don't understand that.
Thank you, Councillor Nees. Councillor Winters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 11, Mr. Chairman, happy with statement of proposal 2, 3 and 4. The one I'm nervous about is, like Councillor Von Dadelson, was the regional infrastructure targeted rate. To me, it's a bit nebulous. It's a bit it's not specific enough in terms of what it's required for. And I'm thinking, going forward, I'm thinking of the proposed 3 water issues that we've got coming before us. 3 waters may take a bit longer than what the Crown is wanting. But to me, this is just not specific enough. And I know targeted rates have to be for a defined purpose. And so I'm not sure how you want to work this, Mr. Chairman, but I'm struggling with on the where are we? On the recommendations on page 10, 2A. How do I vote against the revenue and financing policy just for the regional infrastructure targeted rate? Because it's just not tight enough for me to proceed out to the public, because it's a bit wishy-washy in my view.
Chief Executive.
Good morning, councillors, and Councillor Winters, given the conversation you've just had, I would recommend and note that the word unlikely is causing that nebulous. So if we say not, it will not result in a specific targeted rate for 2022-23. It is enabling only. That will actually clarify that potential to be confused. So we can change the documentation to say it will not result in a regional council setting of a specific target rate in 22-23.
So how do you see clause 2 being drafted up, Fiona?
We will amend the information on page 17 of your agenda and add in more detail in that box on regional infrastructure to be very clear that it's enabling only and it will not result in a targeted rate for the annual plan year. You'll recall, Councillor Winters, in your conversations, you were seeking to be proactive here, and this was particularly related to regional spatial planning and the Strategic Planning Act that we expect to be introduced next year. So it was to get ahead of that. That's why you were looking at consulting on this specific policy.
Okay. Look forward to this discussion with our community, Mr. Chairman. I think we might have a bit of pushback from it, but let's wait and see. Happy to proceed today, but let's wait for the discussion and hear what our community has to say. Message ends.
Thank you, Councillor Winters. Councillor Von Donaldson, you had your hand up, but it's gone. You satisfied? Thank you. Right, any other commentary, councillors? Otherwise, Mr. Lecomte, anything else to add?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right, that takes us through to the resolutions, councillors, and noting the comments regarding the section 36 charges made by Councillor Von Donaldson, myself and others. Noting the request for change in the narrative regarding the infrastructure fund, and I'd suggest, Fiona, that we add more narrative to it rather than just say not, because I think the important thing there is that this is an enabling provision only, and that a process, a criteria will yet have to be deliberated on and decided by councillors, something to that, to make it very clear that this may be start of a process. It may end up there, it may not end up there. So if we can capture those in there. So councillors, can we move to the resolution? Can I have a mover? Councillor Winters, you essentially moved the recommendations. Councillor White, you're seconding it. Any further discussion? All those in favour, raise your hand. Against? Carried. Thank you. That takes us through to Toy EDA, and I know we've got Stephen Lamb here, and I see there's 10 minutes allocated to this. But essentially, councillors, you'll see from the agenda, this is just a renewal of an existing facility that was put in place in 19, I think. So it's a renewal, and you'll note that the other TEAs are moving, and I'll just get an update on whether any of them have actually done it. So I don't think we need a lot of discussion. Mr. Lamb, do you want to make any comments?
Through you, Chair, it appears that Mr. Lamb is not here, but I can say that it is procedural and all councils are putting this onto the agenda. It's an exemption from reporting under a CCO. So, Councillor Nees, could you repeat your question?
Oh, can you just put up your
we can't see the chat.
Oh.
I think the short answer is yes, Jane, but
thank you.
State your chat.
Yes, so I was just asking, I had my hand up before you passed that amendment, the resolution, but I was just asking for clarification if there were going to be any amendments made as a result of my queries on those two policies and statements of proposals. So that was my question. It's not to do with this paper, Mr. Chair, it's last paper.
Oh, my apologies, Councillor Nees. I wrote down all the changes that you were seeking. Yes, I can give you that assurance.
Thank you. Councillor Crosby.
Thank you, Chair. I have no issue with the exemption, but could someone tell me what the actual accountability and transparency mechanisms are, if there are any at all?
So through you, Chair, Toy EDA can and will report to Council. They have done so in the past. And there are regular reporting through to strategy and policy as part of the economic development activity in terms of Toy EDA.
Councillor Winters.
Resolution 3, Mr. Chairman, Potiki Whakatane and Kaore are going through the same process. Have they all agreed to this? And if one of them says no, what happens then? Because all 4 of us have to be on the same page, I guess.
Yes, that's correct, Councillor Winters, and in the past every councillor has agreed. This is procedural. I see no reason why the other councillors will not agree.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll move the recommendation. I have a seconder. Councillor Crosby. All those in favour, raise your hand. Against, carried. Thank you. That takes us through to, let's see, where's my run sheet disappeared. Recommendation from the Public Transport Committee. So, Mr. Thurston of Von Dadelson, have you heard from David Spears?
Mr. Chairman, I have heard nothing from David Spears. I think isn't there meant to be a PowerPoint to go with this from staff?
Right, Mr. Llewellyn.
There is indeed.
My comment regarding hearing from Mr. Spears is recently as yesterday. The Chief Executive had a discussion with David Spears. He was endeavouring to ring me. I haven't heard from him, and Councillor Von Dadelson, but his commentary yesterday, I don't know whether, James, you've captured it in here in terms of this presentation, but it's a critical component before councillors make a decision.
Chairman, just to be transparent, I got a phone call from David Spears yesterday. It was very brief. He said that he had just been talking to our Chief Executive and he was endeavouring to talk to Councillor Von Dadelson. So, but I think he was under a considerable amount of pressure. But Fiona, you may be able to fill in some gaps, but it basically centred around some apprehensions from Treasury with what was being proposed. So you may be able to fill in the gaps.
I was home all day, so
okay.
Okay, well, let's hear from James, because James is aware of.
Yes,
James is aware of this discussion, but it's a material issue before you take a position on this. James.
Thanks very much. Good morning, councillors. I do have a presentation which I will run through and endeavour to address all of those particular issues. So, what seems like a lifetime ago now, on the 14th of March, the government announced a 3-month period of half-price public transport fares starting on the 1st of April, which is tomorrow. And that was really to help normal people deal with the cost of living increases that have become increasingly apparent. So it was part of a wider package which included cuts to the fuel duty. So at the Public Transport Committee, 3 days after that announcement, as part of the chairperson's report, I made specific mention of the proposal from the government to introduce the half-price fares. And during the discussion, there was a lot of interest from at least some councillors around extending that half-price scheme to be fully free fares for that 3-month period from 1st of April to the 30th of June. And as a result of that discussion, the resolution that you see on your screen was passed, and the key words are highlighted in bold towards the bottom of that paragraph. So requesting that staff investigate the options for a full service incorporating free fares with the aim of improving patronage and aligning with that government announcement of the half price fares, and again for a trial period of 3 months. So in essence, the rest of this presentation is a summary of that investigation. So if we wind back to November 2018, the Public Transport Committee at the time had a paper on how to improve patronage on public transport. And as part of that paper, research was commissioned from consultants MR Cagney to look at a variety of policy levers and strategy items to improve public transport patronage. And one of the reports they put together was the one you see on the left-hand side of your screen, which is around the value proposition of free fare initiatives. So specifically looking at what happens when public transport fares are made free. And the table that you see on the centre and right-hand side of your screen essentially summarises some of the main conclusions from that report. And what it essentially looks at is the estimated change in passenger demand based on a number of different things you can do in the public transport system. So we have bus fares, we have the passenger wait time at stop, we have the actual in-vehicle bus travel time, and also the overall coverage of the network measured by vehicle kilometres. And the MR Cagney research looked at a variety of real-life examples and came up with some overall conclusions as to what happens when you change a particular service level. So the key column, and the one that we really need to remember, is on the right-hand side. So this is the estimated change in public transport demand when you do something to those service levels. So the bus fares one, the literature concluded that there would be a 0.3% increase in public transport patronage for every 1% reduction in bus fares. And you can see in the table that the other service levels also have numbers associated with a 1% change. So the next row down, it shows passenger wait time at the stop. If that is decreased by 0.64%, that leads to a 0.64% increase in patronage, is per 1% reduction in waiting time. So every 1% reduction, patronage increases by 0.64%. And you can see there in the table, there are similar figures for the in-vehicle travel time and service coverage, all based on a 1% change in that service level. So what the table essentially shows is that bus fares alone, of all of those items, are actually the least effective means of changing patronage. So generally, the higher the percentage figure, 0.72 versus 0.3, for example, the more effective that particular service level is at changing patronage. And one point to make is that actually these items often need to be introduced in combination. So these service levels were just simply related to changing one of those factors. But if you change all of them, then you actually get a much bigger increase in patronage overall. The pink box at the bottom of the slide summarises what is recognised to be the biggest urban area in the world where they have introduced free public transport fares, and this is Tallinn in Estonia, a city of about 400,000 people. And free fares were actually introduced in 2013 in response to a really big increase in car travel, particularly since Estonia became an independent state in the early 1990s. The free fares initiative was also preceded by an increase in service levels. So free fares alone was not the only lever that was pulled. And the free travel was limited to to bus and trams only available to city residents who actually had a smart card. Interestingly, and before the free fares came in, the fare box recovery rate, which, as you know, is the proportion of public transport operation costs that are recovered through ticket sales, was 40%. Interestingly, that's the same target figure that we have in our current regional public transport plan. But the key conclusion is really the next one. So a study after the introduction of free fares suggested that in the first year, there was a 3% increase in passenger demand, and much of that was attributed to other factors, service improvements and the new priority lanes for buses. So that 3% wasn't just as a result of free fares. I was reading this morning that in the second year, there was a further increase of another 3.5%. But interestingly, the change in behaviour was not what was generally expected and desired. So the majority of new bus passengers actually came from people who previously walked. The number of people who switched from using a private car was relatively small, about 5% of the patronage change. But researchers did find there were evidence of social benefits, so there was improved access to the city. But overall, the MR Cagney report concluded that there are a number of strategies for improving patronage, service frequencies, reducing travel time, and expanding hours of operation, or, and this is critical, disincentives to driving, such as parking and road pricing. And these are all likely to lead to higher shifts to public transport than just reducing fares on its own. And that's a really, really important conclusion. If we want to increase, as we certainly do, public transport patronage, and we wish to reduce single occupancy car use, then a package of measures is required. Simply introducing one measure on its own is unlikely to have the desired impact. It is worth summarising that there is a lot going on in the mode shift space as we speak. So we have bus network refreshes in Tauranga, Rotorua and the Eastern Bay. We have a travel demand management and behaviour change programme, which is currently being completed by consultants. And of course, we have the Wednesday Challenge, which is a live behaviour change initiative being funded through the Council's long-term plan. And we also have a number of business cases, either in progress or shortly to kick off, which will look at the medium to longer term strategies necessary to deliver mode shift. So it's not as if there is nothing going on in this space. There's actually a lot. But the point is that these things need to be given time to be fully planned and implemented before we're going to see, in my view, a major shift in behaviour change. Now, the key issue that we have to think about here is, what is the actual financial impact of implementing free fares? So the government half price scheme will be fully funded by the government. So there will be no additional cost to the council for that scheme. But if there was a decision to implement free fares for the same period of time, from 1st of April to 30th of June, then there would be a cost to the council associated with that. So this table outlines some of the financial and patronage impacts. So the first column just simply shows which area of the service we're talking about. The second column, this would be the additional cost to the council of moving from the government scheme, which is 50% reduction in fares, to fares being fully free. So you'll see for that 3-month period for the conventional bus network, you're talking about fare revenue foregone. So this is fare revenue we would have collected that we wouldn't now collect if fares were free. We're talking about another $170,000. The important thing also to emphasise is that these figures do not include total mobility, which is a key part of our public transport network, particularly for people who can't use the conventional services. If we were to include the revenue foregone figures in terms of the cost to council as a result of making total mobility free, then we would potentially be talking about another $200,000 for that 3-month period. So if you added in total mobility, you would be edging up towards the $400,000 of revenue we would not be able to collect as a result of free fares. The next column just simply summarises the forecast reserves deficit if those costs in the previous column were added in to the existing figures. And then the last 2 columns suggest what level of patronage you might expect if there was a change to fares. And this, in my view, is highly optimistic. But if you go back to the slide before last, and if you remember, every 1% reduction in fares, you would be looking at a 0.3% increase in patronage. If we assume those figures to be correct, then if you made public transport half price, which is the government scheme, you would expect a patronage change of 15%. And so you'll see in that column, those are the additional bus trips we would see if there was that 15% patronage change. The right-hand column then says what would happen potentially if fares were made completely free. So again, if we assumed that every 1% reduction in fares led to a 0.3% increase in patronage, then you would have the figures that you see in that right-hand column. But remember, what actually happened in Tallinn in Estonia was that the changes were much, much lower, 3% year on year for the first 2 years, and then about 1% after that. So I think the conclusion I would say is that for a 3-month period, if we saw anywhere near 15% or 30% patronage change as a result of changes to fares, that would be an extraordinary result. And I'm certainly, from my perception, not convinced that that would happen. But it is important to recognise that that this could happen if there was a seismic shift as a result of this policy. So some of the key challenges we would have to implement a free fares initiative. Well, given that the government scheme starts tomorrow and staff over the last 2 weeks have been working very long hours to make the changes necessary in the ticket machine so that the fares are accurately captured, there wouldn't be any time to implement any further ticket machine changes. So the only way fares could be made completely free from tomorrow if everyone was essentially let on without using a B card or paying any cash. And the problem with that is that it would mean we would not have the B card data that we need to actually assess whether those patronage changes would occur. Essentially, people would get on the bus. If we were lucky, the driver may push a button on the ticket machine to record someone getting on the bus at a certain location. But that is as much data as we would have, and certainly less data than we currently have through the B card. As I mentioned earlier, the implementation of half-price fares is already a significant time commitment. And if we were to try and implement this free fares proposal and we wanted people to still tag on and tag off with a B card, you'd be talking another couple of weeks' work to be able to make that happen. Depending on the levels of patronage, there could be pressure on peak services. We already have reports and witness accounts of buses that are full, particularly with school children, not stopping at bus stops because they are full. So in the last month, we've had 18 complaints about buses not stopping, primarily for that reason. So if more people do get onto the peak services in particular, that could create additional pressure, and there is no money to increase the number of services. We are where we are with that. Now, at the start of the discussion, there was a mention of Waka Kotahi, and I've had various conversations with colleagues in that organisation, and there is a lot of concern both within Waka Kotahi and, as I understand it, in the governments about proposals to extend any scheme currently in place to provide free fares. And the reason for that is that Waka Kotahi in particular are working really, really hard to persuade Treasury that the transport system as a whole requires significantly more investment than the National Land Transport Fund is able to provide. Those discussions are ongoing, and the concern that Waka Kotahi have is that the optics of a large regional council deciding to essentially give away more revenue from fares to make public transport free at a time when they're trying to say to Treasury we need more revenue to do other things. That's a particular concern that they have. It is also worth mentioning that the scheme that Waka Kotahi are administering for the half price fares is based on still collecting that 50%. So if we don't collect any fares, there is, I believe, some question about whether Waka Kotahi would allow us to claim anything for the half price fares. The last point is that free public transport travel, whilst it does have many benefits, does create some issues around antisocial behaviour, which we saw for a period of time when public transport fares were made free during the COVID-19 outbreak back in 2020. And we have concerns that if buses are made free, everyone is just able to get on, we will have a lot of people using the buses to keep warm, to ride around without any real purpose. And those issues are things we have already experienced. So in terms of recommendations, we certainly are going to implement the government half price scheme. We're ready to go with all of our ticket machine changes and comms. We intend to monitor patronage impacts over the next 3 months using the B card system. So we'll have a better view of exactly what figure is going to be accurate in terms of patronage changes. Our recommendation at this stage, for the reasons I've set out in the previous slide, is that we do not extend the scheme to provide free fares, and that we await the regional public transport plan and the forthcoming technical review of fare setting before we consider any further changes. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So can I take it that you gave us all the problems, and in the last slide you've given us a recommendation in terms of the solution? So this recommendation in front of us supersedes and makes redundant the one that's in our papers. Is that right?
Yes, essentially. I mean, the recommendation in the paper was to consider the practicalities and impacts of a free fare trial. Our recommendation based on that investigation is that we should not do it.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask the Chief Executive to just, in a soundbite, repeat the discussion that James said he had with Waka Kotahi yesterday, because that's really relevant. Then I'm going to ask Councillor Von Duddleson, as Chair of Public Transport, to give his view to councillors before we move to discussion and then vote on it. Fiona.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The issue that was raised with both James and myself yesterday was the lack of revenue that this would incur, and for councillors to particularly note that we would not get the additional Waka Kotahi funding because it relies on us getting revenue in the first place. That is a key point for you to note. So the figures that James has provided, we don't expect that they will even, they may be higher. And a key assumption with this half price fares is that we need to collect revenue to receive the waka kotahi subsidy.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. Mr. Von Duddleson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, can I first of all thank our staff who even in the last 2 weeks with this government announcement have been working all God-given hours to try to get that implemented. So I think our staff have done a really commendable job over the last year, but particularly recently under very trying circumstances on public transport. So just putting that on record. I think that one of the compelling things to me is I know we're in a COVID world, but we can't afford to lose any data, albeit because of COVID that it is skewed, and to not be able to use the B card when we're finally starting to make progress on that would be a huge turnaround from using good data to make good governance decision making. So I support the staff recommendations here. I know that politically it looks like a sort of no-brainer to do it, to give free fares, but there is a cost. And we only, as I said last week, public transport, our targeted rate, which is 100% targeted rate in Tauranga, most of the expenditure is in Tauranga, and we've gone from 15 million to 18 million to 25 million to over 30 million, and with staff costs looking at 40 million, which is a huge portion of our council operations. So I just urge caution before we actually start spending more money on a community that is in big trouble anyway. And I think when I say a community, I'm talking about the whole of the region in actual fact. So I am happy to move the recommendations, supporting staff's comments.
Thank you, Andrew. Can I now go to Councillor Thurston, because you're close to this and you've had a discussion. So your view on the recommendation?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that I've been in something of a conundrum, and I think I speak for other colleagues too. At the end of the day, all we want to affect is behaviour change and passenger growth in public transport. And as we know, we've tried a number of levers and we've tried a number of initiatives over the years. In the back of our minds has always been the government chanting this mantra around multimodal, which has put huge pressure on us. Like Councillor Von Duddleson, I put huge hope and expectation on the rollout of the B card, and that was fraught with issues, as we all know. And it does sadden me to see that technology in some aspects would have let us down again if we had pursued what our original intention was here with this particular recommendation. But as I've said with monotonous regularity, and I've referenced Councillor Crosby and others, we've all been in the room when ministers have been chanting about trial. And I just thought in my heart of hearts that this was a golden opportunity to once and for all put to bed the call from the community that free fares is going to really put bums on seats on public transport. Now, just winding it all back, and I know we don't want to go back in time, but yes, that was quite a interesting meeting, the one that MR Cagney came to back in 2018, and they were referencing the data that had come out of Estonia in 2013. But I do think we're only getting half the story here, Fiona and James, because my memory is pretty good, and I distinctly recall them referencing other major cities in Europe, and I know Amsterdam was one. And there were some, I think, also up in Scandinavia that had all trialled free public transport, and it had minimal effect, if any, on increasing patronage. So when that was made, that statement was made in a public meeting, Glenn Crowther, who's well known to all of us, and I think it's fair to say Glenn would consider himself a public transport lobbyist, he made contact with MR Cagney and then emailed us all to say that MR Cagney said that wasn't what that actually said at all. So I got somewhat confused at that point in time. But half price fares were only going to be a 3-month trial. Clearly, Treasury has got some apprehension about it and the funding of it through Waka Kotahi. But I just saw it as a golden opportunity once and for all to trial it and to put it to bed. But on this particular instance, I've got to say I do defer to science, research and data. And I commend our staff for what they've pulled together today. So, but as James has rightfully pointed out, and we hear it from Commissioner Selwood on a regular basis, at the end of the day, disincentives is going to be the only lever that is really going to get the Tauranga public transport system moving, in my view. So, and if I can also say another reason to you, Councillor Von Danielson, I don't know why David didn't contact you, but the main reason for the call to me was a heaving apology about that shambles of a meeting that we had with Nicole Rosie, the CEO, in terms of her late arrival and how embarrassing it was to elected mayors from around the region. So it was a heaving apology to start with, but no, they're my thoughts. But I would like to think that we can now communicate this some way proactively to our public transport lobbyists, and as we all know, that we know them by name, and there's a number of them in Tauranga in particular, to say, look, this is the reason that we have deferred and gone back to this decision that's been put up by officers. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Thurston. Councillor Nees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, thanks to staff for being responsive and giving the extra information I asked for. But I still have 2 pieces of information before I can make my final decision. And I do acknowledge that the position that's been presented is a very compelling one to support the staff recommendations, but there's 2 bits of information I'd like. One is what has been the increase percentage in our school service for youth following our implementation of free fares on their school service, because that's a real life example in our Tauranga environment as opposed to a modelled example overseas. So could you tell us what the actual change in patronage has been on our school service since it went free?
So through the chair, previously we have reported in Tauranga a change in total patronage of an additional 95,000 or thereabouts school kids after the end of year 1, essentially. Not sure what percentage that is, but it's certainly quite a significant number. Once again, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that previously those children may have walked and now they're taking the bus, but actually for a few stops. Also, we're getting increasing issues of antisocial behaviour on our buses. Now, whilst I won't connect that to the consequence of free fares, one of the concerns I have is that when you make public transport free, people don't value it and they abuse the service we provide. And if you've seen some of the photos of what some of the school children have been doing to our buses, I think people would be appalled. So I'm not saying that free fares for school children is a bad idea and we should stop it, but we have to think about the unintended consequences of making public transport free and the message that sometimes sends to people who perhaps would want to abuse the services that we provide.
Thank you. But the fact is, the actual by far exceeded the estimate that you put to us. If it's a 90% and 90,000 increase, and you're saying that's roughly a 33,000 increase for 100% free fares for the whole of the network, that's quite different. So going on to my other query, you mentioned that it took a large number of hours to make the changes to support the ticketing system for the half price free fares. I think one of the suggestions made by Councillor Brunning when he raised this issue was not for the whole 3-month period, was potentially to try to stage it or to try a month with free fares. So that would be a third of the additional costs that you've been recommending. But what I'm thinking is the time required to make those changes to the ticketing system may not justify a 1-month trial. What would be your position on that?
Through the chair, I would completely agree that for that very short period of time, the additional work that staff would need to do is out of proportion to the benefits that would be received. In my view, even 3 months is a relatively short period of time in order to be able to understand any changes in patronage. You know, ideally, you would do any fares trial for at least a year before you're able to conclude whether there's any long-term shift in patronage. So I think it would be out of proportion.
Thank you. Well, regrettably, I was in favour of supporting some form of pilot of free fares across the whole network, just to test to see if the results we've had from our school service would be achieved also on the rest of the network. But given your very compelling presentation, and not least of which is the advice provided from Whakakotahi, who fund half of the cost of the public transport system, I regrettably can't support a trial and will be supporting the staff recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Nees. Councillor Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make some general comments, if I may. First of all, I would like to put to bed the whole question of looking at Estonia. I've been a frequent visit to Estonia and to Tallinn, and the population, the populace and the geography are so totally different to Tauranga. I don't think it bears any relevance whatsoever, so I wouldn't like to hear it mentioned again in this context. If we look at the initial table in James's presentation, it shows that pulling all the levers is still only going to affect the patronage by less than or about 1% of what is already an abysmally low patronage. My view is that the ratepayers of Tauranga are paying through the nose for something which only a tiny percentage of them use. And until some meaningful measures are put in place to make public transport more attractive to the users, then I'm not prepared to vote for even 1 cent increase on what we're spending. What I think is we're already spending far too much in this area for the benefits we are receiving. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Love. Councillor Winters.
I'm a little bit confused now, Mr. Chairman, because if I go back to that slide on page 122, James, you've got the financial patronage impact. Are you saying that if we have a 15% patronage increase, it's only going to cost this council $20,000 over the 3 months? Is that what that figure says?
Through the chair, I'll just go back to the table if that's okay. So we're talking about a total cost to the council of fare revenue foregone of $170,000, and it's split by the figures you've seen there. So the patronage,
if we have a 15% patronage increase, it's only going to be 21,000.
No, those patronage figures, they are numbers of people, they're not money.
Oh,
That's the patronage change. So, for example, if you were looking at Tauranga, you've got a cost of council of 126,257. If there was a 15% increase in patronage, that would be another 16,645 people over those 3 months.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, I still don't know what success will look like after this 3-month trial. James has put up 2 scenarios, 15, 30%. You're saying that 15% is pretty optimistic based on overseas studies. So I'm still at a dilemma to know what success looks like at the end of this 3-month trial. And if it's not successful, what are we going to do after 3 months? And there is still no change in patronage.
Yeah, through the chair, I think that is the key issue that is facing the government and Waka Kotahi, is having some good data to understand what would actually happen if we reduce fares by 50%. So it will be very interesting to see if there is any change in the patronage as a result.
Chief Executive.
So, Councillor Winters, from tomorrow, we're introducing the half price fares and using our regional integrated ticketing system to do so. So we will have data for you after the 3-month period on the increase in patronage. James has said that the modelling says it's quite ambitious, but we certainly will be able to tell you how successful it has been with half price fares for the next 3 months by continuing to use our B card.
Okay, so
thank you, Fiona. And I think, Councillor Winters, the really important message here is that research that was on the bottom left-hand side of your screen from Cagney and whatever it's called, which essentially is what councillors have arrived at in terms of a suite of changes that need to be implemented. Some of them within our control and some aren't, but that's the guts of getting change. Councillor White.
Kia ora, Chairman, through you, and thank you, staff, for an excellent report. I do support the recommendations. It's an interesting one, Mr. Chair. I feel as more of an observer than a frontline participant like Councillor Thurston and Councillor Von Dadelson, that we are dealing with a very, very complex issue here. And James's comment that something given free is not always appreciated, and I certainly I believe in that as well. It doesn't actually exact greater quality in the context of responses from public. And I see that in the context of antisocial behaviour, not just in the context you mentioned some of the behaviours of school children, but actually there's a bit of a fear factor out there as well, from my observation, around people taking the bus service in the context of the antisocial behaviours they experience, and that then tends to label the bus service as something I ain't going on them. And the other thing is too that there's a constant reminder in the back of my mind that this is got a lot to do with climate change, environmental impacts that we're trying to achieve here. And that message is being, subjugated in many respects by a lot of the behaviours of people. And how do you change that? It's almost a holistic scenario that you've got to look at all things that you can bring together to get the changes that we want. And Mr. Chair, your comment that there are things we can control and other things we cannot. And one of the things that's very difficult to control is the antisocial behaviour and the understanding of people what we're trying to achieve here. So having said all of that, I do support the recommendations. I have little faith that changing fares and reduction in fares is going to have the desired outcome, but I support the need for a trial to actually maybe put this to bed, that this ain't working. So what else is there to do in this particular space? I hope it works, but I'm not optimistic. Kia ora, Mr. Chair.
Kia ora, Councillor White. Councillor Rose.
Kia ora koutou. I'm gutted. It is sad to see the public transport system in the state it's in, and I think moving forward, I would have loved to have seen us try at least with the free fares side of things, but I think I think moving forward, there is a clear opportunity as well as challenge sitting with the relationship with central government, because hearing about these conversations that are being had between certain councillors and staff in Waka Kotahi about treasury and about all this different stuff, it sounds like there's infighting between central government agencies, and actually that isn't our problem. Our problem is trying to get patronage. So I would have thought we would have put the patronage of or getting higher patronage before some stupid infight with central government. That's just my opinion. I'd also love to keep an eye out on Environment Canterbury as well, who are currently consulting on making their fares free. And that's through their annual plan at the moment. And yeah, I'd really love to see us kind of continue to look in their space, because they have had challenges there, but they are moving forward, and they are a closer relation to us as a regional council than Europe is. So yeah, look, overall, I'm gutted. I will be voting in support of staff recommendations reluctantly, but at the same time, I want to commend staff for the mahi that you guys have done over the past 2 weeks. It is a quick turnover, and the fact you've managed to bring something as detailed as this is worth many congratulations and a bouquet of flowers to you, James, because 2 weeks to get that sort of information is bloody spot on. So well done. But yeah, again, really gutted that we couldn't move this forward. However, I do look forward to seeing the results of the 3 months at half price. So, ka mihi nui.
Thank you, Councillor Rose. Councillor Crosby.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, James, and your team for a realistic report. That's what I describe it as. And I would support the recommendations not to proceed with the free trial. As we all know, it's not free. People pay for this, other people pay for it. And you will create an expectation that you won't be able to get out of, as we found with student bus fares, which I actually do support. My biggest concern is the inability potentially to get data off the B card. That's absolutely critical for the rest of the mode shift initiatives, that are well underway in terms of either business case or actuals. And our colleagues at TCC, of course, have been critical of the slowness of data coming out of the B card system so they can make their strategic investments. So the last thing we need to do is enhance that frustration, because you do need data to make good investments. And I support what Councillor von Dadelson said in that space. So again, it was worth a look at, but we're not in that space yet. And you overlay that, of course, with the extraordinary conditions of COVID still in people's behaviour patterns, you won't get a true indication of what the influence of a free public transport would happen at this point in time. We've got to get through COVID and get into a degree of normality, and then you might consider such a process. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crosby. Councillor Clark.
Yeah, good morning, James. A couple of questions. I mean, what intrigues me about the free bus fares and being funded basically from the government is that to try to engender some social change, followed by a reduction in the price of fuel to encourage people to stay in their cars. Do we have in our database any indication to say, for instance, if petrol were $4 a litre, would that actually be the stick that would encourage people to go into public transport, as opposed to the carrot of dropping the price by 50% for a trial. Is there any correlations there in those pricing mechanisms?
Yeah, through the chair, there's certainly a long and comprehensive list of studies over the years that have examined the interplay between the costs of driving, whether it's fuel, whether it's parking, versus the propensity for people to get onto public transport and out of their cars. And the conventional wisdom in all cases is that you need both. But critically, if car use is to become more expensive, then you need a good alternative, because otherwise the danger is people will say, well, I still need to use my car, therefore I'm just going to have to pay the additional costs and therefore have less money for other things, which is certainly not something that's particularly desirable. So that's why it is critical, in my view, to get the product that we're offering, which in my view is certainly better than a lot of people think it is, but get it really, really good and get it integrated in people's lives so they feel they can use it. And they can actually save money by using public transport compared to having to pay for parking and the costs of fuel. So yes, there is a strong correlation, and that's why we need a holistic approach to mode shift, not just focusing on one lever here or there.
Thank you, Councillor Brunning. Councillor Brunning. No, Councillor Brunning.
Sorry, you were cutting out there. Yes, thank you. I must say I am disappointed, but I do concede that if we're not going to get funding from Whakatahi with a free fare, then we have to give it away. But I do question what information we're going to get out of a reduced service anyway. We're working on a weekend service for I don't know how long. And what we're going to get out of that. So from a point of view of trying to increase patronage, it seems like this is just not going to work, even with a government half-fare subsidy. So, yeah, unfortunately, we've come to this position, and I just have to concede. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brunning. So I'm going to ask the Chief Executive to go through, so everybody is dead clear what the recommendation will be. James, in the meantime, can you stick up the recommendation? And Fiona.
Yeah. So through you, Chair, you have the ability as the parent body of council to consider the recommendation from the committee and either adopt, modify, refer or decline. So the staff recommendation is to decline the public transport recommendation for the reasons given in the slide that James presented on the key challenges. So you are declining, the recommendation is to decline the public transport committee reason, for the reasons being there's no time to implement the ticket machine changes for 1 April. The free fares from 1 April would mean very limited data. The implementation of half-price fares already has a significant time commitment. There is possible pressure on some peak services. There's concern from Waka Kotahi around giving away fare revenue, and there is potential for anti-social behaviour issues. Those are the reasons why you would decline that recommendation.
So, councillors, are we clear? Mr. Crosby.
Yeah, my understanding of the recommendation from the Public Transport Committee was that council staff investigate options. They didn't actually, the way I read it, seek to have free fares. And that's what we've seen. That's what recommendation 2 currently says. So it's not a case of declining something. It was a fresh new recommendation based on the report we've now seen from staff.
Thank you, Councillor Crosby. Yes, you could do it that way as well, and that you can either decline or defer any further investigation of free fares or put forward a new resolution, as you've said.
No, but it's important we understand what the request was from the Public Transport Committee.
That's correct. It was only to investigate.
Correct.
That's quite correct.
So we're not Yeah, and my understanding is that we've now seen what I'd describe as a pretty robust report to carry on and make recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crosby. And you'll see that the Governance Secretary has put up wording on the screen in light of the conversation that's been had in discussion.
Okay, right, need to move on. Councillors, Councillor Von Duddleson, Chair of Public Transport Committee, you prepared to move the recommendation? Clearly there's a consensus from feedback from councillors.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to move.
Seconder? Councillor Crosby, second. No further discussion. All those in favour, raise your hand. Hope they're all up because we can't see everybody here. So against, carried. Okay, thank you, councillors. That will take us through to, there's no items not on the agenda. That takes us through to the closing karakia. Mr. White.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Ke tau ke tātaka tō te ata whai o tō tāta wiki ahu kraiti me te aroho te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu ake. Āmeni. Kia ora tātou.
Right, thank you, councillors. So we'll see you all again on Tuesday. And just so you know, Fiona